voting has started. Up to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Thanks to everybody who signed in on Zoom, to those who are here in the room, who made it through the crowd marching into the iftar dinner. Before I introduce our speaker, let me say just a few things about the session. The Foreign Policy Association, roughly a year ago, decided to commission a paper on NATO's future. Sometimes they get it right and sometimes they don't in the choice of topics. I think this time they got it right. There was a time, a long time, when talking about NATO focused more on its past than on the future. Descriptions as the world's most successful alliance are accurate in my judgment. NATO has contributed to integration and peace in Europe. It's kept the US engaged in Europe. It's deterred conflict and nuclear war with the Soviet Union, a non-trivial accomplishment. But many asked, and some still do, why we still need NATO when the threat it was designed to counter had disappeared. Such thinking evaporated rather quickly in February of 2022, when Putin invaded the Ukraine. And with the recent addition of Finland and Sweden, NATO is bigger and more integrated than it ever has been. I've already said more about the topic than I should, because our speaker this evening, Rose Gottemoeller, knows many, many times more about NATO than I do. Among other positions that she has held through the years, she was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. She was the Undersecretary for International Security and Arms Control in the US Department of State, and headed the Carnegie Center in Moscow for a number of years. So Rose, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for sharing with us. If you have a burning question, raise your hand, but we'd like to hold the questions until after the formal presentation. So Rose, it's over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to everyone on Zoom as well for being here tonight. It's St. Patrick's Day after all. I've been chasing my grandsons around all day, and we just sent them off to go home to bed. So it's been a day when I haven't honestly been thinking very much about NATO, but nevertheless, I did want to talk about NATO as it is today. This is its 75th anniversary year, and there will be a big summit meeting in Washington on July 12th and 13th this year. And it will be a very interesting moment for the alliance because, as you may remember from seeing it in the media within the last month or 6 weeks, Donald Trump on the campaign trail, when asked by someone, well, what if NATO allies are not paying their fair share for their defense? He said, well, then the Russians, Vladimir Putin, can do whatever the hell he wants with any ally that is not paying their fair share for defense. So this has created a lot of anxiety among our NATO allies in Europe with the thought that, wow, if President Trump returns to office, then we may be at a moment where the United States, maybe it's not going to formally withdraw from NATO. And in fact, some legislation was passed last year. There's very strong support for NATO on Capitol Hill, bipartisan support for NATO on Capitol Hill. And so some legislation was passed last year that said the president would have to seek really the view of the Congress before he could formally withdraw and legally withdraw from NATO. That might constrain Mr. Trump from a formal withdrawal, but he could do what we've been calling in recent weeks a soft withdrawal, refusing to appoint an ambassador to NATO. And the US ambassador at NATO has always been one of the key leadership figures in the alliance deliberations in Brussels. Or he could refuse to appoint the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR, SACEUR since World War II has always been a 4-star American. First SACEUR was Dwight Eisenhower. So there is this long tradition of some of the most senior American military people being assigned to the supreme military command at the alliance. And so perhaps Mr. Trump would refuse to appoint that military commander, in which case the allies in Europe and Canada would have to essentially decide how to carry NATO forward without the United States, at least for 4 years, and then, see where things go from there. So I thought what I'd like to do tonight is to talk about my experience as NATO Deputy Secretary General from 2016 to 2019, which actually coincided with much of Mr. Trump's first term in office. And I saw him come to NATO a number of times for summit meetings and experienced his interaction with the NATO member states during that period. And so give you a feel for how I'm thinking about a second Trump term in office and what that might look like. I'm not predicting that, and I want to stress that from the outset. I'm not predicting that in any way.
You're not listening to me, Dad?
Hello?
Okay, well, no, I just remembered that
I think you have to mute.
that concert. Actually, I take that back. The choir was.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I hope everybody on Zoom is muted if you want to make phone calls or talk to your grandkids or whatever. In any event, I'll talk about my 3 years as NATO Deputy Secretary General and the experience that we had at NATO during that period, and then talk about how I would think about a second Trump term in office and the NATO alliance. But again, I'm not predicting that. We're in the midst of an election campaign, and who knows what's going to happen next November. So, and currently President Biden is extraordinarily supportive of the alliance, extraordinarily supportive, as I said, but there is also this bipartisan support that is impressive on Capitol Hill. And I see it every day in the reaction of both Republicans and Democrats to NATO and what it is doing to support the Ukrainians in their war with Russia, but also to build up NATO defense capability and capacity. So, to begin with, it was quite a shock, I have to admit. I had just arrived at NATO in October of 2016, brand new NATO Deputy Secretary General, the #2 civilian. My boss, Jens Stoltenberg, who is still now the Secretary General of NATO, he's been, because of the war in Ukraine, he's been extended in that position 3 times. He's served now 10 years, which is a long, long time for a NATO Secretary General. But I came into his office that morning after the election results were in, and he just gave me a big hug and said, well, this is going to be very interesting. And I said, yes, it is going to be very interesting, because Trump on the campaign trail had already made clear his position that the allies really needed to pay up. They needed to pay for their own defense. And to be honest with you, Jens Stoltenberg and I were always very, very supportive of that, because the allies had promised, after Ukraine was invaded for the first time in 2014 and the Russians seized Crimea and destabilized the Donbass, the NATO allies at the Wales summit in 2014, they promised that they would spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. And when I arrived at NATO, and then when Mr. Trump was elected for the first time, very, very few of the, at that time, 27 NATO allies were paying 2% of GDP. The United States, yes. UK, yes. A couple of others like Greece, oddly, yes. But very, very few allies were paying 2% of GDP. So this was a constant, actually, this is a constant in the history of the alliance, that American presidents are complaining about NATO free riders. There's a wonderful National Security Council meeting that's been recorded from John F. Kennedy in 1962, saying, I am tired of these freeloading allies. When are they going to start investing more in their own defense? So this has been a bipartisan issue, but they did promise, after the shock of the invasion of Crimea in 2014, to put 2% of their GDP into defense. And so this was something that Jens Stoltenberg and I were very supportive of. And we said, all right, we'll work with the president to try to get more allies to step up to their obligation, their commitment in this regard. But I have to say it wasn't easy. The very first time Mr. Trump came to the NATO headquarters in May of 2017, we invited him to the brand new headquarters. We had been across the street. Have any of you been to NATO before? Tom, you've been to NATO, yeah. You remember the old, there was an old Belgian military hospital when Charles de Gaulle kicked NATO out of Paris back in 1967 when France withdrew from the military command of NATO. The Belgians said, okay, you come to Brussels. And they put NATO headquarters in an old Belgian military hospital on the outskirts of Brussels in the middle of a cornfield. It was conveniently close to the airport and still is. But if you can imagine going from the palace on the Champs-Élysées in Paris to going to a cornfield on the outskirts of Brussels, it was kind of a shock. And the Allies at that point didn't know if the alliance was going to survive. But I do give the Belgians a huge amount of credit. They both supported the alliance in terms of providing for military and civilian headquarters, but they also stepped forward and took leadership in terms of articulating policy for the alliance and priorities at that point. And so NATO did survive de Gaulle's attempt to pull back from it. So there we were in our new headquarters. We'd finally moved out of this ancient hospital that I got there again as new Deputy Secretary General. A huge autumn storm came in and I hear water trickling behind me. And I look behind me in my office and water is pouring down the wall because the roof was leaking on that old headquarters. So we moved across the street into this brand new headquarters, very shiny and nice. Well, Mr. Trump didn't like it. He didn't like the architecture. And you know, he's a real estate developer. So that was the first thing that really didn't appeal to him, was the architecture. But then he had a hard time kind of with the NATO protocol matters. You know how it was his first foreign summit. You know how leaders line up to get their pictures taken? They call it a class photo. Well, you probably saw the famous clip of him striding up onto the stage and shoving aside the Montenegrin president, the newest member of NATO at that point, Montenegro. Trump didn't know who he was shoving aside, but I mean, it was for us who knew this was Montenegro, the brand new, you know, small ally, but in a pretty desperate strait from some coup attempts that the Russians were perpetrating, you know, to see him shoved aside in that way was very difficult. But the other thing that was difficult on that occasion is it was when Trump said publicly, allies don't pay up. I'm not going to stand up for the Article 5 commitment. The Article 5 commitment is in the Washington Treaty of 1949. It basically says it's what we call the one for all and all for one. If an ally is attacked and asks for assistance from the NATO alliance, then the NATO alliance steps forward to assist that ally and fight for them. So, and Trump said, you're not paying up? Forget about Article 5. So this, again, a big shock to the allies at that point, and a big kind of wake-up call that they were really going to have to work on this issue of burden sharing and step up to their commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense. So for the next 3 years while I was at NATO, this was an unrelenting drumbeat from President Trump. And he was tough, and he was really, you know, just raking them over the coals constantly during summit meetings. And it made, you know, it made everybody anxious. This was not the normal leader's behavior, you know, of anything. And again, very transactional. You put your money on the table, you owe the United States, put your money on the table. He didn't get this notion of kind of collective defense, that we were all in it together, and that the NATO allies were helping to provide for US defense by defending forward, by essentially keeping threats away from our shores. And so that, you know, I think it was very difficult. It was a wake-up call, but for Jens Stoltenberg, and I give him huge credit, this was an opportunity. He brilliantly pushed the allies and said, all right, We've got to use this as an opportunity to bring defense spending up. And he was very, very good at talking to Trump about the pledges that had been made. We had a famous chart. It's just a very big briefing slide that showed the numbers going up like this, and it said $100 million. And it was a very simple chart, but he would brief the president with this, and he'd say, this is thanks to you. And it was still the case that allies were not, many of them, stepping up to their 2% of GDP requirements. And in particular, you may have read that Trump was not getting along with Angela Merkel, the chancellor of Germany at that point. It's because Angela, honest woman that she is, said, there's no way we can get our defense spending up to 2% of GDP before the 2030s. And Trump hated that. And he was, really angry with her all the time whenever they would get together. And it was a very, very difficult setting from that perspective. But Jens used the opportunity to say, okay, let's get working on this. And the numbers did start to come up. More and more allies got to 2% of GDP. Not many, to be honest with you. I think there were 8 out of, again, 28 by that time we had another member state come in. And so it wasn't going fast, still not going fast enough. But in the end of the day, it was, I think, a very positive thing that the allies began to recognize, thanks to this transactional behavior by Mr. Trump, that they had to spend more on their own defense. So let's fast forward to today. Oh, last thing I'll say about this is that Jens Stoltenberg, he's, if you've seen him on TV, he's a Norwegian, right? So he's very kind of sticks to his talking points, never gets emotional, very polite, very articulate and well-spoken, but doesn't get at all wrapped up and emotional in the media. Well, we used to joke that he became the Trump whisperer, because with this calm, kind of straightforward, Mr. President, let me just tell you, here's what the allies are doing, boom, 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 boom. And he would brief him in a very calm and straightforward way that was, I think, very, very satisfactory to Donald Trump. It was a good way of interacting with him with this calm, practical approach. And Jens was a money man, not a money man, he was a numbers man, because his first job was as a state statistician. That's what he graduated from university. So he could cite, numbers, budget numbers, and he went through all of it with Mr. Trump, and Mr. Trump loved that. So we began to call Jens Stoltenberg the Trump whisperer, because he had this ability to deal very well with Mr. Trump. So fast forward to today, and you ask, wow, what's it going to be like? Jens Stoltenberg is finally leaving this October after the summit, this summer in July. He's finally leaving the post after 10 years. And he actually just turned 65 yesterday. Yesterday was his birthday, so that's the cutoff point at NATO. You must leave anyway. They'd have to make a big exception to extend him again, but he's ready to, I think, go on and do something else. So the question is, who will follow him, and will he or she be skilled also in dealing with Mr. Trump? Well, I certainly hope so. But the story is, if it's necessary. But the story is also a better one, because more and more countries now are at 2% of GDP, and it's not because anything that Trump did while he was in office. It's because the Russians invaded Ukraine for the second time in February of 2022. And this was truly a wake-up call for the allies, that they have to take more responsibility for their own security, and they have to be ready to defend against a newly, I would say, I'm not going to say newly empowered, but kind of newly aggressive Russia, aggressive in a way that could, I think, actually threaten NATO in very real ways, should things go the wrong way in Ukraine. So NATO realized, the countries realized they had to defend themselves, and the countries that were the biggest problem for Trump back in the earlier period, like Germany, for example, Chancellor Scholz and his unruly coalition have said, we are going to spend 2% of GDP in 2024. And we are ready to put big investment into the systems that we need to buy, like the F-35, dual capable fighter aircraft, capable of both conventional and nuclear missions, very expensive items. And they weren't able to make that decision 5 years ago when I was at NATO. They were just not able to make that decision. But now they are saying we must invest in our own defense. And allies across the alliance are saying that. And it's a big sea change from the first time that President Trump was in office. So I think from that perspective, just from that kind of transactional, aspect of his presidency, put your money on the table. I want to see you pay up. Frankly, the allies are now paying up in a way that I think I could never have predicted back in 2019 when I left the alliance to go and come here to California and join Tom and others at Stanford, which has been a great pleasure in itself. Although I do miss Brussels. So I think that's probably the main point I would make about a new Trump presidency, is that this 2% of GDP problem is well on its way to solution now. And it's not because of any hectoring by Donald Trump, it's because of the Russia threat. And they really have wakened up. The other factor here is that it is clear, and President Biden has been very clear about this, that the United States needs to turn more of its attention to Asia and more of its attention to defending potentially against Chinese aggression in Asia. And so the United States the pivot to Asia started under President Obama back in 2012, 2013, but it's been interrupted now by the Russian invasions, 2 invasions of Ukraine. But the United States is intent, and the allies realize that there is a responsibility to defend in the Indo-Pacific, and the United States will be paying more attention to that area of potential crisis. And so that's another reason that they feel that they must be prepared to defend in Europe. So let me just, I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes, but just one point of speculation I thought it would be worthwhile talking about, and that is what happens if there is this kind of, as I called it, soft withdrawal at the outset. And President Trump says he's not going to support appointing an ambassador or a SACEUR. What's going to happen inside the NATO alliance in terms of leadership? Because in theory, all allies are equal. Decision-making is by consensus in the alliance. But in reality, of course, the United States has always been prima inter pares, always been the first among equals in the alliance, has always held the pen for important decisions, has always come up with important recommendations and ideas for how to move things forward. I did mention the Belgians and their leading role back at the time de Gaulle pulled back from the alliance, but the Americans on a year-in, year-out basis have been the primary leadership force inside the alliance. So what happens if suddenly America pulls back and is not present in the alliance and is frankly bad-mouthing the alliance? I think that would have to be expected as well. I can see, and you can see now if you're paying attention to the news in Europe, a new kind of coalition forming. Nowadays, the so-called Quad, the United States, UK, France, and Germany, the Quad, they're the biggest countries in the alliance, and they, in terms of their GDP, in terms of their economies, clearly countries like Canada are enormous, but they don't have the size of defense budgets and budgets overall that a Germany or a France, UK, US have. So the Quad forms this kind of leadership core with, again, the United States always being the first among equal. If the United States absents itself, you're still going to have that triumvirate, I think, of the UK, France, and Germany taking a leadership role. And oh, by the way, you'll have France and Germany continuing to lead in the European Union, and the UK now outside the European Union, but providing that non-European Union voice in the leadership of Europe. Because the one thing I'll mention is Emmanuel Macron, the president in France, has been tempted really over the last almost 10 years by the idea of strategic autonomy, pulling back from NATO and putting more and more emphasis on defending in the context of the European Union. You know, to my mind, as again, as Jens Stoltenberg and I always said, as long as the European Union is doing things like developing new operational capability, new military force structure that can also be put to NATO missions and operations, there should be no competition here. But this notion of strategic autonomy for Europe has been read in the kind of Macron concept as meaning France and others pull away from the alliance and put their bets on the EU. I think it's a ridiculous idea because we have an alliance that is very well established, very well developed, with a command and control structure and you know all the infrastructure in the alliance to defend. So you'd be kind of replicating it to try to build it up in the EU. But just a point, that's why it's important to have this triumvirate with, yes, France and Germany, but also now the UK outside of the EU and providing that non-EU leadership perspective. Interestingly, now other countries of Central and Eastern Europe are also stepping forward, and Poland has been the one that is most forward in this matter. They have been, for one thing, investing now 2% of GDP for a good long time, and they have spoken about going to 4% of GDP or even more because they are truly, truly worried about defending against an aggressive Russia. And so I could see a kind of new quad developing where you would have, you know, UK, France, Germany, and a country like Poland that historically has suffered greatly from Russian imperial ambition, as well as Stalin's participation in the division of that country back during World War II. So they are really, really motivated to defend and would, I think, want to join in leadership of the alliance. So I think that that is an important kind of leadership mix to think about. But the other important thing is there are two major new members of NATO. And just this past week, I was so proud to see it. The NATO flag was raised in Stockholm, and at NATO headquarters in Brussels, the Swedish flag was raised for the first time as a member, full member of NATO, joining Finland, who joined the alliance last year. So we have two new, very important member states in the Arctic region. Very important because Russia is building up its capabilities to fight in the Arctic. And to be frank with you, the alliance needs more capability in the Arctic. So having Sweden and Finland, very, very capable armed forces, very well experienced fighting in polar regions. It's great to have them as part of the alliance. And by the way, they're creating now the Baltic Sea as a kind of NATO lake. So it makes it very difficult for the Russians to take advantage of the Baltic in any time of conflict. I've been speaking in a very, I understand, pessimistic way about the future, because I do think that we've had a wake-up call with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and we need to be thinking carefully about the future of our defense in Europe. We're also facing, as I said, a threat in the Far East from a newly, I would say, emboldened and empowered China. So we have to be thinking seriously about our deterrence and defense going forward, I think. But I really do feel like NATO will be capable of really weathering a second Trump term in office. And presumably it would be no longer than 4 years. That's what I'm counting on. And so in that case, NATO would be able to resume, I think, the full US participation in not too long an historical period. But this is the somber note to end on. I think the US, if that happens, and there is this kind of soft withdrawal or pullback from NATO, the confidence of the allies in the strength and the viability and the kind of reliability of US leadership will be shaken for a long, long time, and maybe forever. The United States would have to do a lot to pull back from that. So I think it is going to be a difficult time for the alliance, but nevertheless, I do feel confident that the allies are in a position to be able to lead and to be able to continue to depend on the NATO alliance for their deterrence and defense in Europe. So with that, perhaps I'll draw to a close and look forward to your questions and your comments as well. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask two initial questions, and we'll open it up both here and on Zoom. The first question,
I'm going to sit down if
you can sit down.
that's all
You
right.
can sit down. And we'll check and see if
Assuming
you're
that
still in, yep, you're still in front of the camera.
everybody can see me. Yeah, yeah. And you can see me. Okay.
Building on where you left off, that your concern, I'm sure shared by many in the room here, about a Trump victory in November. The allies see this. The allies worry maybe as much or more than we do. What are they doing? How much of the current actions are in anticipation of tough times ahead and things that they are sorting out among themselves to get in place so that the damage is minimal to the capability? The second question is a variant of that, which is NATO as a military alliance to deter and defend, and NATO as a political organization, which Macron doesn't like because of the weight of U.S. influence. As a political organization,
Precisely, yeah.
we're absolutely essential as a military organization. And what is your sense of kind of the balance between kind of the two functions of the NATO organization as an organization and as an extension of U.S. influence in Europe? That my experience is mostly in the political dimension of it, where we had enormous influence because we brought so much to the table. But over to you.
All right. On your first question, you know, the NATO allies are already getting some practice right now, figuring out what they will have to do should the United States pull back from the alliance. And the practice is coming about because of the impossibility, at least so far, of getting the assistance package for Ukraine and Israel passed in the House of Representatives. And so I've actually been impressed to the degree to which the allies have stepped forward and said, okay, we know Ukraine needs military assistance. What can we do to make it happen now? And there are problems. There are problems here in the United States, and there are problems in Europe in terms of ginning up military production, because we have left our defense industrial capacity lag in recent years, and for good reason. We all took a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. So the Europeans, they do not have the defense manufacturing lines that they had earlier. We're also in that situation. We'll fix that over time, but in the meantime, the Europeans have been looking around saying, okay, what can we do to help nevertheless? And I was very impressed that I know him. He was the senior military figure at NATO political headquarters, so the chairman of the military committee, General Peter Pavel. He's now the president of the Czech Republic. And he stepped forward and said, okay, we, the Czech Republic, have found 800,000 rounds of ammunition that's in the right caliber for the Ukrainians. So who's going to join us in putting money into a pot to buy this ammo and get it to the Ukrainians? And so that's what's been going on over the last couple of weeks. So I have to say I'm impressed. I mean, they're not sitting there passively and wringing their hands. They're saying, okay, I guess we're going to have to figure out how to do this ourselves. I don't think it's enough. I think the United States still needs to be involved. There's no question about that in my mind. But nevertheless, the I think the Europeans have got a fire lit under them now that they're gonna have to maybe do this themselves, and how are they gonna do that? And so let's see how things go forward. There have been other indications. Now they've fallen down on a few things. They said that they would produce 1 million shells for the Ukrainians by this month, and they haven't yet produced the 1 million shells. Again, problems with defense industrial capacity, but they certainly have got, they've got the right idea. They've got the bit between their teeth that we need to take responsibility for that. So I do think that's a good thing. On your second question, it is to me extremely, to be honest, Tom didn't tell you much, but I'm mostly an expert on the USSR and Russia. I've spent my career working on nuclear matters, doctrine, strategy, nuclear arms control, et cetera, expert on the Soviet and Russian doctrine in the nuclear arena. So suddenly I get taken off to NATO. This was a job after President Obama appointed me after I'd been his Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And he sends me off to Belgium. I did not really understand the inner workings of the alliance at all, and I freely admit that. So I was on a very steep learning curve my first several months in office, but I learned a huge amount, and with huge respect about how the alliance does operate according to consensus decision making, and about how the United States steers that. It's very much, mostly behind the scenes, corridor conversations, quiet discussions, all those diplomatic dinners that people complain about sometimes, but they are the place where a lot of business gets done. And in the end of the day, I came to respect this political role of the alliance because it's a kind of glue that it assures consensus decision making, but it also assures the cohesion and the survivability over the alliance, and has done so for a long period of time. And that then is the kind of foundation stone upon which the deterrence value of the alliance is built. The Soviets tried to divide the alliance, divide and conquer. Putin, every day of his life, tries to divide the alliance. But it is that kind of political cohesion that really makes the alliance survive in the way it has and continue to prosper, continue to be a very positive institution. And even more powerful today, I would say, because of the behavior of the alliance during the crisis in Ukraine, that they have so pulled together with this cohesion and this one mind to support the Ukrainians. So I think it's been a very remarkable to me evolution in that regard, even since the Ukraine war started, the second Ukraine war started. We forget the Ukrainians have actually been at war since 2014, but this one has been the full scale, sadly, invasion. You had a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought you had a question.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me give you.
I don't even know how good this question is. But I remember when the Ukrainians were kind of begging to join NATO. What's the prevention of that? Why is that prevented?
Well,
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question?
Yes, the question was, the Ukrainians have been begging over time to join NATO, and why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult? Why hasn't it happened so far? The NATO alliance has very much an open door policy. And so at the Bucharest summit in 2008, during the time of George W. Bush, essentially NATO committed to Ukraine, to Georgia, to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to the Republic of North Macedonia, if they could solve their problems, solve various problems, that they would be members of the alliance. And only the Republic of North Macedonia, through some very heavy diplomatic lifting, by the way, has been able to get to the point of entering into NATO, which they did actually right after I left NATO in 2019. But Ukraine and Georgia have had a lot of heavy lifting to do in terms of addressing governance problems and particularly problems with corruption. This war in Ukraine has served as, I think, an instrument by which President Zelensky has really beaten back a lot of the governance problems that they have had. He's fighting like a tiger against corruption. And now the question is, all right, it's probably not the moment to join NATO in the midst of a war with Russia. But I personally believe that Ukraine, it is now the best fighting force in Europe with the most experience, sadly, and best trained, really best equipped, best ready to defend. So I do see once this war is over that there will be, I think, a path to membership more speedily for Ukraine. People ask, well, what happens if the war ends and there's still this division of Ukraine and they haven't regained Crimea, for example? Well, I say to this, I say, we have got to treat this the way we treated Germany during the Cold War years. That is, Germany was divided, the DDR and the FRG, and the FRG was brought into NATO. And then eventually when the wall came down and the country was unified, the entire country then became a member of NATO. And it's the same with the countries of the Warsaw Pact. They all became members of NATO. So I don't see, people say, well, Russia's just going to have a veto. This is a red line for them. They don't want Ukraine to be part of the alliance. Well, let's see what the peace deal looks like and what we can make of a peace deal with Ukraine inside the alliance. But the main thing about a division of Ukraine at the point of a peace deal being made is that Ukraine must never give up on the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty. It's the same situation we faced in the years after World War II and the Cold War years when the Iron Curtain was down across Europe. We just maintain those principles, and when the time is right, just like Germany was finally brought together in NATO, we'll see the same for Ukraine. It's not going to be easy, though. I don't want to sugarcoat it, because the Russians, and particularly Mr. Putin, are dead set against it. But he's not going to remain in office forever either.
Well, they're in a good position for defending against Russia. I mean, they're right up against
Oh my gosh, yeah, they are incredible. And you know, the reason they fought, they talk about fighting like tigers. They fought like tigers, of course, to defend themselves from the initial invasion in February of 2022. Part of their skill as an armed force, as the army of Ukraine, came from NATO training that began around 2014 when the Russians invaded Crimea. I was so proud at their performance because NATO was quietly working all those years, almost, well, 8 years, to train them to be a modern fighting force. And they are very, very good. So I'd love to have them in NATO.
Thank you.
Lou, you want to pick one from the Zoom crowd?
Sure. This is from Marcia. Most of us think about treaties as short-term alliances created to provide mutual support in the context of a particular kind of cross-border conflict. NATO has been around for a long time now. How would you define NATO today as a long-term alliance of, quote, the good guys against the quote unquote bad guys?
Well, the core of NATO's mission is as a defensive alliance in Europe. And to be honest with you, after the end of the Cold War, NATO did drift because its deterrence and defense mission seems to have gone away. And that's actually one of Vladimir Putin's complaints now. Why didn't you get rid of NATO back in 1992? You know, its mission was over with, no more need for deterrence and defense. Obviously, you know, you had other things in mind. Well, NATO did drift, I have to admit, for the decade of the 90s a bit. Then came 9/11. And the counterterrorism mission, the war on terror, came front and center. And here NATO actually came together, not only to help defend the United States, that famous Article 5 commitment I've talked about in the Washington Treaty. It only was invoked once, and that is that terrible day, 9/11, when 2001, when the Twin Towers came down, and we were really worried that continental U.S. airspace was going to be, just attacked. We didn't know how many of these planes were going to come in, where they were coming from, and NATO invoked Article 5 and provided additional air defense capabilities to the United States of America. That's the only time that Article 5 has been invoked. So I like to say, look, the only time the alliance has had to come to the defense of another ally was on our 9/11, when we were facing this terrible terrorist attack. And so, that was then what preoccupied NATO after 2001. And the NATO allies joined us in the war on terror. They joined us in Afghanistan. That's another story, but I wasn't particularly happy about the way the United States withdrew from Afghanistan a couple of years ago in August. But the main point I wanted to make is that NATO was with us throughout that period in helping in the war on terror. So, and then again, sadly, in 2014, the Russians brought a new reason back to the table why NATO should be ready to deter and defend in Europe, because of the behavior of the Russian Federation. So sadly, I wish I could say that NATO's job was done, but I don't see its job being done. And treaties can last a long time. I like to remind people of the UN Charter, which is the basic treaty document, legally binding document that established our post-World War II world order. And I, for one, hope that however ragged it becomes because countries aren't living up to the principles in the UN Charter, I hope nevertheless that it stays, because its commitments are the commitments that need to be front and center for the world community, I think, every day.
That's the only question we have online at the moment, Tom.
Question in the room? Yes, I'll try. So when you have a group where there are many partners, like in NATO, and some are perceived as aren't as big a contributors to the overall, those types of individuals, groups, or institutions tend to be undervalued disproportionately to their contribution. So what members of NATO do you feel who really ought, get more attention, who really contribute a lot, but it's just not known how much they actually contribute?
It's a really good question, because people also ask me all the time, gosh, how do you put up with Erdogan, the president of Turkey, who's always jerking NATO around? And I say, you know what? Turkey is one of the best contributors to NATO operations. The NATO Ops Assistant Secretary General for Operations, the NATO Ops guys I knew while I was there as Deputy Secretary General, said that Turkey always puts their hand up. You need somebody to defend Hamid Karzai Airport in Kabul. The Turks did it. They were there as the security forces throughout the withdrawal, and afterwards they kept the airport running. Okay, you need somebody to, fight in an operation somewhere. Turks would put up their hand and send their soldiers in without caveats. The Germans always put caveats saying, our soldiers can only serve in this kind of role. They must be at headquarters. They can't be out in the field fighting. This was, again, in the earlier period. I don't know what's going to happen, because they are changing their overall, and you probably took note of that famous speech by Scholz, where he said that we are at an incredible moment of change now, and we've got to pivot and think anew about German defense. So that was, again, at the time of the invasion in 2022. But it's the Turks, who are these amazing contributors to the operational capabilities of the alliance, while they are hugely frustrating to deal with. And they cause a lot of problems because, they're Turks, so they love to bargain. You saw how long it took them to agree to Sweden entering into the alliance. And then, Erdogan was followed up by the Prime Minister of Hungary and his bad behavior, Mr. Orban, as well, holding up Sweden again. But yeah, they talk about transactional. They're very transactional, but in the end of the day, they get the job done. And so people ask me who do I think is the worst member of NATO, and I never like to answer that question, but I always tell them it's not Turkey. You may think it is, but it's not. You could, perhaps speculate on some of the others.
What's the negotiation that came on between Sweden and Turkey?
Okay, yeah, I'll just say, the quick follow-up question was, what was the negotiation between Sweden and Turkey? It had to do with the fact that there are a lot of Kurds who have taken refuge in Sweden, and Sweden has given them refuge over the years, and they are key actors in the Swedish government. They're right at the core of some of the parties in Sweden. And essentially, Erdogan accused the Swedes of harboring Kurdish terrorists and said, as long as you're not extraditing these people, we want to send back to Turkey so we can put them on trial, and so it was a very difficult situation. But of course, being transactional, there was also something that the Turks wanted from the United States of America. They wanted new F-16 fighter jets and maintenance and repair kits for the F-16s they have. So that also was part of the bargaining. So yeah, they love to bargain. They're very, very transactional. And so there were pieces that were put together. The Swedes, to their credit, they held on to their principles, but also did put in place some anti-terrorism legislation that was helpful to the Turks. A lot of this, in the end of the day, comes down to face-saving measures. And the Swedes were able to come up with enough face-saving measures that both Erdogan and Orban backed off eventually, under also pressure from a lot of other allies, including the United States of America. So diplomacy, who was it said, it's like making sausage? Oh, it was Bismarck. Diplomacy, it's like making sausage, not very pretty. Yeah.
Since you mentioned your expertise about nuclear warfare, I wondered if you would comment on the what Putin's been saying about yes, nukes. No, I didn't really mean that. Nukes. Yes, I did mean that. Nukes.
Yes, it's very interesting about Vladimir Putin and nuclear weapons. I'll give you my core version of what I think the problem is, but there's no question he's been rattling the nuclear saber. And not only during this most recent war, he started in 2018. He did some of it back in 2014, again, when he seized Crimea. But 2018, he gave this speech when he basically said, well, what's the world going to be, worth if Russia isn't in it? It was one of those comments like, well, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to, blow us all up and take you with us. So there were remarks like that. It was even this kind of apocryphal stuff like, oh, well, they're basically heathens and we're Russian Orthodox, so we'll go to heaven and they won't. This kind of crazy stuff you hear out of him from time to time for many years now. And it really interests me because I remember after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Politburo became extraordinarily disciplined about how they talked about nuclear doctrine and policy publicly. There were only certain people who could talk about it. There was a very strict script that was followed. There wasn't this kind of, waving of threats around, and it was very, very disciplined. Well, Putin came out of the KGB and did not have that kind of central committee, Communist Party, Politburo experience, and that kind of discipline imposed on him. And his life view seems to be formed by a lot of, Russian historians. There's a guy named Dugin in particular who's written a lot and is, has this kind of apocryphal, really, Russia greatness from the old days. And if people don't agree with us, we're ready to, destroy the world and take them with us. And Putin seems quite influenced by this. So he's been and he's also, as we know, we used to say about Putin, oh, what a great tactician he is. Well, if he were such a great tactician, he wouldn't have invaded Ukraine because it's been pretty disastrous for Russia in the end of the day. But he also likes to keep people off balance, and this is very much part and parcel of what he's doing. The other cliche about Putin is that he's a master of, it's not jujitsu, but it's one of those, Oriental wrestling things that keeps people off balance all the time. So people say, oh, that's how he operates. He keeps people off balance. Well, it's attention getting. There's no question about it. But I've really been puzzling whether it has a deterrence function at this moment. And I feel like it's more like the little boy crying wolf. After a while, he keeps saying, oh, like just as you said, oh, I mean it. No, I don't mean it. And at some point, I'm not saying he's going to use nuclear weapons, but it devalues the deterrence value of Russian nuclear capabilities to have this kind of loose talk thrown around all the time.
Lou, do you have anybody online?
No, I do not.
Okay. Peter?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
I just wanted to ask when, I don't know the dates, but when Gorbachev was sort of allowing Soviet central government to dissolve a little bit, all those breakaway countries, did they kind of just declare themselves separate from Soviet Union when they had the freedoms to say so, and then very soon after become part of NATO? I wonder if you could give us a number of how many countries joined up right afterwards.
Yeah. So the breakup of the Soviet Union occurred through 1990, 1991. The Ukrainians unanimously voted on their own independence in August of 1991. I mean, very strong that they were going to become independent, and all the other states of the former Soviet Union. So there were 17 Soviet Socialist republics. They all became independent states, including the 3 Baltic states. No, they're the 3 Baltic states, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And again, here's a case during the Cold War, we never recognized that they were part of the USSR. If you looked at maps of the National Geographic from that period, there was always a dotted line saying, Soviets claim these, but the rest of the world, or an event, the United States of America and its allies, do not recognize them as part of the Soviet Union. So the 3 Baltic states, and then the republics, stretch all the way, we call them the stands, all the way across Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And then the Caucasus countries, Armenia and Georgia.
You're saying they joined the NATO?
No, they didn't join NATO, but they became independent. The 3 countries of the former, I'm not going to say they were never recognized as countries of the USSR, but the 3 Baltic states have joined NATO. And then the Warsaw Pact countries, the former allies of the USSR, so-called allies, they were forcibly held, behind the Iron Curtain. They did not regain their independence after World War II. But from Poland, so it's the 3 Baltic countries, and then from Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, down into the Balkans. All those states became members of NATO. Austria is still neutral. It's the one left neutral state, not Austria and the Republic of Ireland. We used to have this group of allies I would meet with regularly when I was Deputy Secretary General. We called them the WEP5, the Western European Partners, and they were very, very capable partners, kind of near allies. So Sweden and Finland, Austria, Switzerland, and the Republic of Ireland. Those were the WEP5. And so today we now have Sweden and Finland in NATO, and remaining neutral and close partners of NATO, but not members of NATO, are Switzerland, the Republic of Ireland, and Austria. Frankly, the Austrians are so still, I would say, invested in Russia, like even though their banks have been, responding to sanctions and so forth, they still have a lot of sunk investment in Russia. So, and they're their businesses also. So I'd be very surprised if they move into NATO, in my view.
I do have a question online now, and it starts with a comment, or sorry, why was the US so reluctant to give planes to the Ukraine? How can Ukraine fight a modern war without air supremacy? Can NATO provide that to them?
Yeah, it's taken a long time. I've agreed with President Biden's position from the outset, which has been to ensure that Ukraine gets as much of what it can use immediately as possible, because it takes time. Now, I was just reading this past week that the Ukrainian pilots are getting trained to fly the F-16, and certain NATO allies have given the Ukrainians F-16s. They haven't been able to take delivery yet because they're still training the pilots. And it takes a lot of time to train pilots. These guys have been flying the MiG-29, Soviet-made fighter jet, and to suddenly make a switch to the F-16, it takes time. So the Ukrainians, there's two sides of this argument. The Ukrainians have said, well, why didn't you give us them at the outset? And now we'd be trained up and ready to use them. But the real emphasis in the first months of the war was emptying out the weapon stocks among the former Warsaw Pact countries. So again, that group of countries, Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc., they were still using Soviet-built tanks, Soviet-built armored personnel carriers, Soviet-built howitzers. This was stuff that the Ukrainians could use immediately. And so all of those stocks were emptied out in the first year of the war and sent to Ukraine. And I thought that that was the right decision. But now, of course, and the United States has agreed on longer and longer range missile systems, providing them, and the F-16 fighters, et cetera. So slowly but surely, the Ukrainian armed forces are acquiring more, I would say, NATO-built weapon systems, not only built in the United States, but also built in European countries as well, which is another reason why I think Ukraine will eventually be an excellent ally of NATO, because their systems will be interoperable with NATO systems. They won't be, Warsaw Pact era equipment. So it's a tough question, and there's debates and discussions about this every day. But I do think that NATO made the right decision to get them the stuff they could use immediately, and really make sure that they had, the biggest stocks they could have immediately. The other thing I want to say, and I like to stress this, the Ukrainians haven't been able to establish air superiority, but neither are the Russians. They are not flying their fixed-wing aircraft nor their helicopters over Ukraine because the Ukrainians will blast them out of the skies. They have a very, very good indigenous missile industry. The Ukrainians were the great missileers of the USSR. There are two gigantic ICBM plants in Ukraine, one at Pavlograd and one down at Dnipropetrovsk. They built those huge SS-18 missiles, these huge intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are really good at the missileer business, and you can see it in the way they have built up their indigenous industry very, very quickly, and they have very, very effective not only ballistic missile systems, but also cruise missile systems and drones. So they are doing very, very well in that regard. And I want to give the Ukrainians a shout out for that, because it's been extraordinary the way they have denied the Russians air superiority. Now, of course, the Russians can send missiles in, and the Ukrainians have actually been doing very well with their air defense systems as well. And the United States and NATO allies have been providing Patriot missile defense systems, other missile defense systems, but the Ukrainians are also using their own indigenous systems like the S-300 that were produced in the Soviet era, and have kind of juiced them up, modernized them so that they're more capable. So they are not allowing the Russians to have air superiority. The missiles get through. There was just a big attack on Odessa the other day, again, where a number of people were killed. It horrifies me, this notion, might have read about this weekend, of these double tap attacks where they'll attack a civilian target, and then when the emergency responders rush in, they send another missile in. To me, is so craven, and well, it's horrific. It's another sign of the kind of, I think, criminal behavior of the Russians during this war. But in any event, I will say that the Ukrainians have done a good job denying air superiority to the Russians during the war. And they've also outright denied them control of the Black Sea. If you haven't been paying attention, look into this. You know, they just killed off another Russian patrol vessel, the Sergei Kotov, a week before last. It's one of their most capable patrol craft, this new modern family. They sunk the flagship, the Moskva, right at the beginning of the war. And so the Russian Navy has moved from their base, their headquarters based in Sevastopol on Crimea. They've had to move back to Novorossiysk in Russia and even farther east into the Black Sea, and essentially to get away from the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are not permitting the Russian Navy to operate in the western reaches of the Black Sea. It's an extraordinary story, but it's allowed the Ukrainians to open up what they call their humanitarian transit corridor, essentially from Odessa and their Black Sea ports down. They use proximity to the NATO littoral, because if you go from Ukraine, next country down is Romania, and then Bulgaria, and then you hit the Bosporus and Turkey. So this is all NATO littoral of the Black Sea, and the Ukrainians have used this to good effect to protect grain shipments, but also shipments of other products like metallurgy. They do still produce a lot of metal products in Ukraine. So what was I reading the other day? They've sent 1,000 ships now through this humanitarian corridor since a year ago when they started it up, and 30 million tons of cargo. So it's pretty impressive what they've been able to do, because they chased the Russians out of the western part of the Black Sea.
Is there any issue of a differentiation between purely defensive weapon systems and ones that are more of an offensive nature? Is that part of the discussion at all within NATO and supplying those weapons to the Ukraine?
It's been very delicate because the United States and its NATO allies have provided more capable missiles to the Ukrainians, missiles that can go greater distances, are highly accurate. But the United States, and I give President Biden a huge amount of credit for saying from the outset, there will be no NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. We will assist Ukraine in every way we can, but we don't want this to turn into a general war between Russia and Ukraine that could escalate into a global war and even a nuclear war. So we're going to, keep that assistance going, but not send NATO forces in. I think that's absolutely the right decision. But it has meant that the United States has had to be pretty tough with Ukraine and say, okay, we're going to give you these more modern missiles, but you may not use them to attack Russian territory proper. Crimea, yes, because we don't recognize Crimea as being part of Russia. That's where it gets a little bit delicate, because Putin says, this is our territory, this is Russia. We say, Ukraine can defend itself on its territory. So you can use your missiles up to the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. If you're going to go and attack Russia, you do it with your own indigenous missiles. And so that's apparently what has been happening. The Ukrainians have respected that delineation up to this point, but it gives you an idea of some of the delicacy of, again, this deterrence balance in this war. But I think, frankly, neither the Russians, certainly not Mr. Putin, nor the NATO countries want to become embroiled in a general war. And Putin and the Russian armed forces, they could not take on an additional fight with NATO right now. So they're also deterred from seeing that happen.
Are you saying that that we're saying, or NATO is saying, that they could send their own missiles into Russia?
We haven't said anything to them. And in fact, for the longest time, the Ukrainians were maintaining a neither confirm nor deny. position. Like last year, they sent some, I believe, they never confirmed it, but some drones exploded near the Kremlin. This was kind of a big show of, look, we can even threaten you on your territory. In truth, you know, they have been able to, I call it harry. They have been able to harry the Russians. They just blew up a big, well, it's not even a big one, but it's a oil refinery in Kaluga, and apparently it did some significant damage. So they're doing things like that. They blew up another oil refinery on the Black Sea a couple of weeks ago, and it shut the place down for a while. So they're harrying the Russians on their territory. They're still not really accepting, I mean, making a big deal of it. It's more like it's a message to the Russians. You know, you think you can go after us with these long-range strikes that are killing our civilians. Well, we can go after you too. Again, they're fighting this war. So it's, to my mind, it's a little bit dangerous, but their territory has been attacked. So they're fighting this war the best they can. Yes.
Sorry, my mind went blank for a moment. This will be a speculative question, but can you talk about what will be happening between Russia and Ukraine? Can you talk about how you mentioned the possibility of peace treaty? Can you go into more detail about how that might come about and how the two sides might come to realize that they need to stop fighting and they need to start negotiating?
Yeah, it's a great question. So far, neither side has given up on its maximalist demands. And basically what Russia's demanding is that Ukraine throw in the towel on its independence and become a vassal of Russia, that it dissolve its current democratically elected government and have a new election that would look like the election President Putin just had in Russia this weekend. So, you know, the Russians have these maximalist demands. The Ukrainians have also said, we want every inch of our territory back. We don't want a single Russian troop on any inch of Ukrainian soil. So they both got maximalist positions, and that's why it's not been possible to negotiate up to this point. My own personal view is that I would like to see a ceasefire take place because enough young men, and frankly, in Ukraine, also young women have been killed. The Russians don't have women in combat roles in their armed forces, but there are Ukrainian women fighting in this war. And enough people have been killed and civilians have been killed, especially in Ukraine, that it's time, I think, to think about a ceasefire. But if I were to proceed, I would demand a sign of goodwill from the Russians to begin with. These long-range attacks on civilian targets, like we saw again with the attack on Odessa, and this, as I said, double tap thing going on. This does not seem like, to me, an expression of good faith in negotiation. So I would say there has to be some sign shown that Russia is truly ready to negotiate, and Ukraine will have to reciprocate by stopping attacking like oil facilities on Russian territory. That would be a sign to me that the two sides are ready to put a ceasefire in place and then move to negotiate. Again, I think it likely that for some period of time, you would see a division of Ukrainian territory, but I do not believe that there should ever be any sense from anybody that Ukraine should permanently give up the territory of Crimea or the Donbass, the provinces of Ukraine that, the regions of Ukraine that Russia has seized. I think that principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity needs to remain sacred. You know, I was just talking about the Baltic states. For 70 years. We never considered them part of the USSR, and we need to be thinking in those terms now. Same with the division of Germany. We just need to keep in mind that the principles have to stay intact no matter what. But it's hard, and you know, the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives. They're fighting for independence and sovereignty, and to my mind, they're fighting for us as well, because they're defending the principles that we stand for.
Lou, do you have any more on Zoom?
No, I do not.
Yeah, well, I have one more from,
And there's a couple people behind you too.
go ahead, Diane.
Also a speculative question. You were saying that your comments were showing a somewhat pessimistic view. What would an optimistic view look like? What would we like to push for a better NATO?
For better NATO. Oh, I was thinking about the outcome of the war in Ukraine. From my point of view, although it's really risky because you don't know what's going to happen in Russia. I'm not a person who stands up for regime change. Apparently Putin is petrified that we're pushing for regime change and for dismembering the country. I think that's ridiculous that we would destabilize Russia in this way at the end of a very long and difficult conflict. That would not, our interest has to be stability in Europe and stability on the Eurasian landmass, stability and security for all. So why would we dismember Russia and remove its leader and try to destabilize the country? That would not create stability and security for all. So to my mind, the best case scenario is the Russian people decide that it's time for and I think Vladimir Putin has to go. But the Russian people decide it's time for Vladimir Putin to go, and they move to a successor of some kind. And a lot of people say, well, it's not going to be anybody better than Vladimir Putin. He's going to be, it's going to be another KGB criminal type mafioso. Well, maybe so, maybe not. I know a lot of really, really good, I call them the technocrats in Russia, who are extremely skilled managers. They know their business very well. Russians are super smart. So I do feel like they could get it right if they had a chance. And gosh, I was so sorry to see Navalny killed a couple of weeks ago, because that was a fine example of a great Russian talent for leadership. So I will continue to hold out hope that the Russians will at some point move beyond this man in the Kremlin and be ready to try for a better future. As far as NATO is concerned, I hope I've left you with the impression that I think NATO's on a good track right now. They're in much better shape than when I was DSG 5 years ago. Again, it's nothing, it's nothing. We start out talking about Mr. Trump. Nothing Mr. Trump did. It's because the Russians have forced them. It's been a wake-up call. We have got to get our act together for our own defense and to be ready to deter Russia. And I think that's a very good thing. It's just led to this impressive cohesion in the alliance. And I think NATO's passing it through its 75th anniversary year in really good shape, in my mind.
You mentioned earlier that Vladimir Putin made a tactical error by invading Ukraine. Do you think it was a strategic error?
It was both a tactical error and that he thought he could do a blitzkrieg, in 5 days, but it was also a major strategic error because it's really destroyed, I think, so much of the modernization work that the Russian Federation had done in the years since the breakup of the Soviet Union. 30 years it's been since the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation had come an extraordinary distance. And now to see that all undermined is, for me, it's a great tragedy as a Russia expert. So I do hope, again, that they have enough talent and enough brains to pull themselves out of this, but it's not going to be quick. I think it'll be a generation before they recover from this, if they are able to do so at all.
And you've mentioned the fact that the invasion of Ukraine has just brought NATO much closer together. That to me seems like a very strategic blunder on his part. If he wanted to blow it apart, like he's doing the exact opposite.
No, absolutely. That's an absolutely great point that I should have made. And the fact he wanted a smaller NATO, he ended up with a bigger NATO with two very capable Nordic countries, Finland and Sweden, joining the alliance. So had the exact opposite effect of what he said he wanted.
I'm going to do one last question because it interests me.
Prerogative of the chair.
That the strengthening, the integration, the expansion of NATO, the focus on the Russia threat, has that put paid to the idea, that very divisive idea of out-of-area operations, that NATO capability should be used in peacekeeping stabilization around the world?
I don't think it's completely put paid to that notion, Tom, but I have to say at the moment, the attention of the alliance is focused on the need to bolster defense in Europe. But you saw even, and some of you may not be aware that the peacekeepers in Kosovo are NATO peacekeepers, and they have been really standing up for the continued independence of Kosovo since the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s. And that peacekeeping mission continues. They've just had to kind of defend against what's going on in the northern part of the country with the Serbs, of course, stirring the pot up there. So it's been a difficult period in Kosovo. I fear, frankly, a bit that Russia's been up to mischief in the Balkans now, with the people's attention focused on Ukraine. But nevertheless, that's an example, I think, of where NATO has been carrying forward a role in a very responsible way, with actually a rather efficient investment of men and material and women as well.
Rose, thank you so much for a terrific presentation. Thanks to everyone who not just attended, but asked good questions that made this a very productive discussion. That please join me in thanking Rose for giving us her Sunday evening.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Great to be here. Thank you.
Just
Good discussion.
one final word, that next week's session is on Indonesia. Our speaker will be Ambassador Scott Marcial, who was the U.S. ambassador to Indonesia, among other places. Scott has asked to do this by Zoom entirely, so he doesn't have to come in from out in the valley. So Lou will send out a notice, but we will not have an in-person session, only on Zoom next week on Indonesia. And again, Rose, thank you.
Just a couple of reminders. Some of you have been emailing me over the last few days that you have lost your Zoom link. Please make sure you keep track of your Zoom link, because you're going to need it next week for sure. And as a reminder, the Zoom link does, we admit the folks about 5 minutes to 7, about 6:55. So there's no need to try to join the Zoom at 6:30. Joining at 6:55 is absolutely fine and appropriate. And with that note, I am going to stop recording and stop the session, and the recording will be available later in the week. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your evening.